So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and today we return to the older version of the game, and this, I don't know exactly when this one will come out, to be honest with you. This is more the sort of thing where I'm just trying to record everything I possibly can before I get dispatched to go away on site once again, so it always pays to try and record as far in advance as I possibly can, so here we are. And also, for another reason, I mean, obviously the old patch is... I guess enough time hasn't really passed to the point, well, it hasn't actually passed at all yet, but there will come a point where this sort of thing is nostalgic. But also, this exact setup on this exact map is something which I did actually in the very early stages of my channel. It goes to show how old the Cardolan outpost now is, and yet it's rather enduring as a map goes. I mean, it is fun to play as when you are the defenders in particular, I think, but it is going to be the United Petty Kingdoms of ARNOR facing off against the forces of orcs, and this is something that me and a couple of my friends did who were in voice chat with me at the time, actually, when I was recording this one, and yeah, it's just something to reminisce on, I suppose. It goes to show how early on in my channel that was. I remember when I had people in voice chat with me, although those days have long since passed. This setup is still something to behold. I mean, I was playing as Rhudaur that day, I think, which is also the same for the player who sent me this battle replay, which is Colonel Speaks 46. But we will be going through the attackers first and foremost before we get on to the defenders. Cardolan outpost, of course, characterised by the settlements in the corner and also the river. I don't know what part the river is going to play in this battle. When we played this setup years ago, we actually didn't defend the river. We decided to, well, I had some ambush troops in the hills as Rhudaur, and then we defended the settlement, more so consolidating. But we have seen both things done in the past since then as well, and actually defending the river is probably more common. A lot of these choke points are pretty nasty, but I don't think that's going to be the case this time around. So we may see the settlement itself actually utilised far more so. So, starting off with Podrick Payne's magic ... I'm sure you can fill in the rest, but Podrick here is going to be playing as Mordor. Mordor, of course, ever present whenever the orcs are involved. The Minas Morgul's Chosen as they are known in the next version of the game, are also a very dependable kind of unit. Obviously a heavy spear, not really the most damaging unit for the class that they are, but they do represent that really nice solid unit at the centre of Mordor's roster, which is just that little bit tankier and, individually speaking, more resilient, although there are 203 of them as well, so they do also have numbers on their side. Just in behind, we have some orc archers. I mean, defending the river would actually be where the attacking archers would potentially come into their own a little bit more. If the defenders do intend to focus their defence around the settlement itself, it will be a little bit more difficult for these cheaper units of archers to get a huge amount of value, but of course they are so cheap, they don't need to do much in order to get value anyway. So we'll just have to wait and see how useful they will be. But orc archers individually, of course, not particularly strong. Numbers really is the name of the game here, but of course that certainly has its place when you're the attackers. We also have some temple executioners over here, decked out in their upgraded armour, one of the best heavy swordsmen that the game has to offer, both in this version of the game and the next one. That's a distinction that they will very much keep. And indeed, as a dedicated unit of this type, none of the Arnorians actually have something which is as good. The Wardens of the North, after all, are first and foremost an archer. Moran infantry are over here as well, obviously more numerous, and this is to be expected from Mordor. You want to try and pack on the numbers as much as you possibly can when you're on the attack, and you know that the Cardolan outpost is rather constricting when you get into its streets, and even if the attacker or the defenders did try and hold the river, you would need numbers potentially to try and force them out of the way. So the Moran infantry, definitely useful regardless of how the defenders decided to set up, and many units of them indeed. Orc Maulers, a cheap unit of course. Heavy axemen like this always have the same weaknesses, especially low tier orc ones. The armour is not particularly good, their melee defence is awful, but for their cost, the amount of armour piercing damage they can chuck out, especially if they do land a clean charge, is actually pretty impressive. But those are big ifs, and ultimately the defenders should have the missiles to be able to make their life miserable, but we shall see. They only have so many after all. Sauron's will represent the better version of this kind of unit. Of course, they're more useful all round. They will be able to hold their own in a melee fight more. They're still, for the cost, not exactly the most defensively adept unit, but they will at least be able to fight many of the rank and file of the enemy force and not fold too easily. Nazgul are here as well. Of course, we've seen the merits of the Nazgul in this version of the game and the next one. If you embed them in the middle of their army, they can be very, very effective over a longer period of time. You don't know how much damage they're actually doing until oftentimes it's too late. So the defenders should be on the lookout for them. Sauron's Will. Of course, the Great Shield Infantry is here. The Blackguard of Barad-dûr represents an option for the Orcish attackers. If they find that the attack is taking a little bit too long, or they see an opportunity in the defenders and maybe not defending a front line as well as they should, the Great Shield Infantry can be used to punish that. But they can also be used at the wrong time, of course, and that's something to watch out for as well. Another unit of Blackguard and some Temple Guard at the back. Armour-piercing projectiles are something all of the defenders traffic in, both in terms of javelins and crossbow bolts, and of course armour-piercing arrows like the Temple Guard, but Mordor's presence means that the steel bow will not be the preserve of only Arnor on this occasion. Then we have Isengard, played by Red Knight. We have some half-orc spear guard on the front line, representing a slightly cheaper option for a shielded unit of infantry than the Uruk-hai infantry. Obviously nowhere near as good in terms of their offensive output, and indeed even defensively they're not going to be quite as solid, but they are cheaper. And also anti-cavalry. This map is open enough in the opening stages that cavalry could be a concern. This would also be another good reason why the defenders will not be advancing forwards towards the river. The Isengard Ballista would be absolutely devastating in this sort of situation, and perhaps it's Isengard's presence on the field which dissuaded the Arnorians from taking up position on the banks in the first place. If they do go in behind the walls, however, the Isengard Ballista will struggle to be useful unless it's in very specific circumstances, but sometimes just its presence on the field is enough to prevent the defenders from moving in certain ways, so it's not just kill counts that you have to take into account when those sorts of things are afoot. Uruk-hai pikemen, of course, are ever present in the Uruk-hai line. A really good anchor as far as the basic unit of pikes go. I mean, they're slightly better than basic, I would say. The armour is very, very solid, and of course their performance in melee is also pretty damn good. Pikes in general don't do damage that quickly outside of a few specific examples. But yeah, the Uruk-hai pikes, especially late on, they could be a real thorn in the defender's side. Uruk-hai infantry here, in numbers, in addition to the half-orc spearguard just in front. The Uruk-hai raiders are the cheaper option, and more numerous, very much the equivalent of the Morannon infantry we just saw, although I think their armour is actually slightly worse. Leather scraps, or it's at least equivalent. Like, they're very, very similar kinds of units either way. Half-orc Baneguard are a little bit stronger than the Orc Maulers that we have seen, but they're also a little bit more expensive to boot, and they come with largely the same weaknesses, just not to the same extent. It's everything you would expect from a slightly more expensive unit. Crossbows are another reason why setting up shop on the riverbank probably wouldn't have been a great idea for the defenders, and why you should try and make use of your fortifications, but it's a risk. If you get into a situation where the crossbows can shoot you and you can't really move, it's a fantastic way for the attackers to gain value. It's one of the reasons why Isengard is so dangerous as attackers. We've seen many times in the past the Uruk-hai crossbowmen really do the business. Uruk-hai Berserkers and Nazkai, of course, the slightly more refined, if that's the word for the Nazkai variant, the bodyguard variant. Armoured, a little bit more skillful. The Uruk-hai Berserkers, of course, very much a one-note kind of unit, but that note is very powerful, especially against the more armoured factions on the defence. And Trolls of the White Hand, of course, this being the older version of the game, they may not be quite as effective as they will be in the upcoming newer version, but they can still be a good spike of damage that the attackers can rely upon as the battle grinds along. Then we have whoever this is, Ellipsis, playing as Angmar. Guardians of Khan Doom, similar to the Uruk-hai infantry, though they trade in a bit of damage for a bigger shield value and just generally being a more defensive kind of unit. Though Angmar, as I've said several times, they wield their defensive prowess and their heavy armour in a very aggressive way, and they're always so useful to have as an attacking force because of their ability to stay alive even when you push them really hard. So that is always going to be useful. Angmar Marauders, again, the equivalent of the Morannon infantry and the Uruk-hai raiders we've already seen, although I think they're worse than those two units, but also slightly cheaper to boot, so that's the trade-off, I guess. A couple of units of Angmar Marauders once again. Witchram Scourge Raiders, so throwing axes means that the defenders won't have a monopoly on that sort of thing, because of course it's something that Rhudaur are pretty strong in. But the Scourge Raiders, the last time perhaps, or one of the last times that we'll see the Scourge Raider variant on foot. So that's worth looking out for. Trolls of Gundabad here, similar story here as with the Trolls of the White Hand. They may not be as effective in this version, especially not this unit actually, because they're actually smaller in this version of the game. There we go. Some Warg Skirmishers. Big fan of the Warg Skirmishers on the attack for attackers, because it means you can use them as cavalry in the open field, you can use them as anti-cavalry hunters, but if all else fails you can still use them as regular javelins and a mass pushing unit late on. So they have some good variety there, and some Witchram Blackguard here at the back, obviously a very strong unit of sword and board bodyguard, which is where the general is as well. Looks like a lot of Angmar's army is actually hidden, which makes for an interesting kind. Apologies for that, there was some sort of interruption there, I'm not sure what that was, but Gundabad Guard and Witch Realm Hammer Guard are here as well with that armor piercing damage. Now then, onto the Misty Mountains, played by Marmaroth. We have a couple of units of Cave Trolls, the weakest sustained combat trolls that we have in the game so far, but they will be able to push through these front lines and be pretty damn damaging. White Uruk Fearmongers are also here. We've got, again, pretty good unit of armor piercing there, as well as the Heavy Goblin Halberdiers. Now it is worth saying that, again, Heavy Goblin Halberds, relatively weak in terms of what they offer, but potentially they're so cost effective, which is one of the reasons why the Misty Mountains, I mean numbers in general are one of the reasons why the Misty Mountains are going to be so useful in this sort of situation. All four of the Orc factions actually bring something slightly different to the table, in spite of the fact they all have something of a horde mentality. Heavy Goblin Infantry, of course, Black Uruks of the Mountains offering a little bit more finesse than the rest of the Misty Mountains roster. More Heavy Goblin Infantry, Goblin King's Bodyguard as well, and more Black Uruks. Crossbows, of course, Heavy Goblin Crossbows means that the Misty Mountains do offer something similar, potentially, to the forces of Isengard there, and Heavy Goblin Spears as well. Excuse me, I'm just going to restart the recording. We will have the attackers still in this little section, but I'll restart the recording and we'll start afresh for the defenders, because something just popped up in the background which has kind of knocked me off balance a bit. So anyway, before it was so rudely interrupted, it turns out it was just nothing. It was just my PC letting me know something completely unimportant. Love to see that. We will go through the defenders, starting off with Arthedain, played by Flushep. He's going to be playing as the linchpin, really, of old ARNOR in Arthedain. Starting off here with some Wardens of the North. Of course, we mentioned the steel bows previously, and they will be very useful at hunting down the higher end units that the attackers are going to be trafficking in, speaking specifically about stuff like the Nars Kai, Witch Realm Hammerguard, stuff that's especially dangerous to the defenders today. I mean, it's only really Cardolan and Arthedain that are more dependent on their armour values, but just in general, you need to find some way of dealing with the really high tier units that especially Mordor have, I think. They have a tendency to have those real sharp end units, which the Wardens of the North are so good at dealing with. Troll Slayers are here, of course, kind of a similar deal here, only close up. Obviously, Javelins will be very useful for the defenders, especially if they intend to focus their defence in and around the ARNOR, well, the Cardolan outpost here. Dunedain Troll Slayers also have that armour-piercing attack in melee, which can be potentially so devastating. And all of the attacks, of course, have got some sort of reliance on their armour as well, so armour piercing cuts both ways, and all of the defenders today have access to it in one shape or one form or another. Arthedain Marksmen and Evendim Archers set up pretty well for elongated skirmishing here. I don't think there's going to be too much of that based on the composition that the attackers have. I mean, Mordor have their Orc Archers, I suppose, and, you know, that's about it, though. The others, crossbows, are going to be the main order of the day, which, of course, these units can also be pretty good at counter-skirmishing with when they have a terrain advantage, such as they should have here. We have the dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights. They'll be really good against the rank and file of all of the Orcish factions today, in particular, looking at a force like the Misty Mountains. I mean, that's pretty vulnerable to this sort of unit, to be honest. They will struggle against some of the really high-end stuff. I mean, they can't really quite keep pace with stuff like the Temple Executioners, but they're relatively few and far between. Generally speaking, this is a very effective unit for this sort of situation. Arthedain Men-at-Arms and Dunedain Peacekeepers, actually. I mean, in this version of the game, regular Men-at-Arms units are not quite as good. We'll see them come into their own a little bit more in the next patch. They won't do badly against the basic units that the Orcs have, but in particular, what I just said against the Fornoster Rhine Knights, against the better stuff that the Orcs are rolling with, this kind of unit can be pretty disappointing, honestly. The Dunedain Peacekeepers, however, can hold their own against those units, and they demolish stuff like entry-level stuff like the Uruk-hai Raiders, Heavy Goblin Infantry, Trash Killers, you would describe them as, and the shield means they're a little bit more versatile when it comes to pressure within a real siege situation than the dismounted Fornos Knights that we went through just now. A couple of units of Arthedain Pikemen. Arthedain are always rolling with some pikes, and trying to clog up those rather narrow choke points that the Cardolan outpost offers is going to be important. We have some Evendim Spearmen with the full upgrades as well, and some dismounted Knights for Dunas. This might be one of the last time we see them as well, of course. They are only a mounted unit in the next version of the game, and the Guardians of the Scepter take their place as ARNOR's sword and board bodyguard unit. Now then, we move on to Colonel Speaks himself, playing as Rhudaur. Of course, having relatively low armour scores means that armour piercing isn't going to be very efficient against you, but Rhudaur in general, their defensive scores are having a lack of armour is not made up for by finesse like it is with some of the Elven factions. They're just straight up easier to kill, so that is worth bearing in mind. The Black Wolds are very similar to the Uruk-hai Berserkers, only they have one less hit point, so they're actually not quite as good, but they are cheaper in all fairness. And the armour piercing, like we said, is going to be very useful against all of the attackers, really. Rhudaur clansmen, and I would imagine, yes indeed, some Rhudaur swordsmen, offering a fairly numerous, fairly efficient front line. The Rhudaur clansmen, their main thing that sets them apart are the big shields, which are not going to really come into effect too much here, but still. We've got some Reforged javelins here also, obviously throwing projectiles, very much Rhudaur's preserve. We've got some Rhudaur marksmen as well, so they too are actually set up reasonably well for a sort of fairly grindy affair at range, but they're actually going to be fairly free to use even these basic archers as they see fit here, I think, the defenders, which could be the thing which sees them through. Troll short axe throwers, throwing axes of course are very, very effective, high base damage, and they can be very, very good as being a phalanx buster, and generally speaking I think their high base damage means that even armour isn't enough to slow them down too much. It's rather an interesting thing. Etenmore's troll hunters as well, good amount of armour piercing range damage on them, good armour, you know, shielded as well, spears. So a versatile kind of unit, although versatile in the kind of ways which you may not see them embrace all of their strengths here. Like the spear anti-cavalry bonus is not really going to be terribly important, but their modus operandi of being javelinmen, that is going to be very important here. Cardolan rangers, foot rangers of course in this version of the game, still very much body piercing, so we will get to see them do their thing again and again. The narrow streets of the Cardolan outpost could be the ideal position for the Cardolan rangers. Didn't see the Dunedain rangers actually in the Arthedain army, but I'm sure they're hidden somewhere. We've got some Cardolan pikemen here as well, actually stronger individually than the Arthedain pikemen, and the lack of a numinous gate guards means Rhudaur actually have stronger pikes all in all than Arthedain, and in this version of the game of course the shields they carry a little bit rarer. In the next version of the game more pikes will carry these shields. Erebor have one, the Rovanian have one, Angmar still retain theirs as well. And we have more Rhudaur swordsmen back here, another unit of the Blackwolves, and of course Cardolan berserkers, combining being a very effective unit of armor piercing shock troops with also having a throwing projectile and a second hit point. Very multifaceted indeed. And last but by no means least, actually close to the riverside, we have Aragorn, who is playing as Cardolan interestingly enough, but I imagine that they will back up a little bit to go back into the settlement eventually. Of course this will be one of the last times we see this variant of Cardolan as well, fighting on home turf as they may be. Minhiriath spearmen, basic but good enough at holding the line, and of course it's going to be really other units that are going to have to do the business for the defenders, outnumbered by an army such as they are. I mean in melee one unit that can certainly do that are the Tharbad Warhammers. This variant of them is still in the next version of the game of course, and indeed this model is also being used for some other units as well, but they have an upgraded version in the next patch as well, which sees them take on a little bit more of a tankier role. We also have some Dunedain captains here. I mean, if Aragorn was going to be rolling with some forces from Cardolan, I suppose it would be these guys. Dunedain captains will find themselves very much at home fighting against some of the lowlier orcs, but also they can hold their own against some of the best that they have to offer as well. A very fine heavy swordsman unit indeed. Mercenary guildsmen offer an armor-piercing unit in melee, although so too do the Minhiriath sharpshooters, whilst also combining that with being crossbowmen. We mentioned briefly with Isengard and the Misty Mountains how deadly crossbows can be for the attackers. They don't need many volleys for them to pay off. However, the defenders will be able to use them more freely, but they also kind of need to, of course. The numbers discrepancy that they face is more severe, so they need this kind of unit to pay off, and indeed more than pay for itself, if they want to be successful. Greenway Garrison footmen, basic units of pikes are going to... we'll see. We'll see how they can do. We have some Minhiriath spears as well. A trebuchet, we've seen trebuchets be so devastating in a few battles recently. And on this map as well, considering again how narrow those interior streets are, which is one of the main things I'm pinning the defenders' hopes on here. Brilliant. Nothing all day, and now people are messaging me. Perfect. More Dunedain captains are here as well. I mean, we are coming to the end of the composition phases, to be fair, so I think I will go and sort that out, make another cut once again. But in all fairness, there's going to be a little bit of a marching phase anyway, and the defenders need to make up their mind exactly how they're going to set up, whether they do set up in front of the settlement a little bit, or whether they retreat fully within its fortifications right from the off. We shall have to wait and see. But yeah, I'll make a cut and we'll rejoin when the battle is about to get underway. So I am going to rejoin the battle here, I think, because as much as this is not where the first casualties are being inflicted, it is going to be very soon. That has been a rather, unfortunately, painful period of needless shuffling around here at the start of this battle, where This is kind of the shape they've been in for the past 2,000 frames, and still nothing appears to be happening from either side, but hopefully that will not be the case for too much longer. And surprisingly I should say, they are going to be defending the river. The presence of the Isengard ballista alone would have been enough to put me off from that, but the Arnorians, not to be deterred from what would have been their first course of action, are going to make this, I think, exclusively a river crossing, based on how long this battle is and based on how damaging some of the units on the attacking side can be in this sort of situation. I imagine it's going to be a case of all or nothing, really. The Isengard ballista is now firing. This, like I said, probably the most significant unit on the field in this context now. I thought it was going to be slightly less effective than it could have been had it been a fight for the settlement primarily rather than a fight for the river. There now. We're going to be trading back and forth with artillery, and this is a fight that Cardolan are not going to win with their trebuchet. Especially not when it's a flaming shot like that. That is going to be enough to... I mean, they got very, very close in all fairness, but all it's going to take is one more volley, and a very important unit for Cardolan will be completely vanquished. And even if they miss, they're still going to be hitting something. Not the most important unit in the world in Evendim archers just in front, but there's also a few dead crossbows there, so yeah, I don't really know what Cardolan expected there. If anything, I would have suggested that putting it in behind the hill over here so the ballista couldn't hit it and then trying to go after the infantry probably would have been the call. Instead, trying to engage in a suicidal artillery duel with the very best piece of artillery in the game for that sort of thing. The Isengard ballista's thicker projectiles mean it's even more likely to hit than the regular ballista, and that is the best unit for sniping out other artillery as is. So yeah, not the best start from ARNOR this in terms of decision making at the very least. Nothing much has really happened yet. But the ground they've chosen to defend and the manner in which they've chosen to do it so far is looking quite suspect. Isengard ballista will have ample opportunity as well to use its flaming projectiles, I think, on some of the units that wait just across the way for them. White Fearmongers also going to be a dangerous force. Snow Trolls as well. Interesting that they're the units that are going in first. Actually, White Fearmongers would make for a very good target for even basic archers. Their unshielded nature means they could be cut down to size. Misty Mountains leading the way with their trolls. Obviously, again, this is possibly going to be the last time that we see this old version of the Snow Trolls. In the very last battle replay we saw on the new patch, we saw the new Snow Trolls. Bigger unit models, as is the case with many of the stronger trolls in the game. Saw them use a very good effect there as well. That old version of the Snow Troll unit has been in the game for quite a long time. It's one of those surviving unit models as well, up until this point anyway, that was always a little bit of a weird one as well, because there was definitely room for improvement on these guys for a long, long time. Meanwhile, hailstorm of arrows and various projectiles coming into this first foray across the river from Marmaroth. I have to say, actually, I'm not entirely certain this is the best call from them either. I mean, ARNOR a bit slow on the retreat with the archers there, but wanted to get a few more volleys in before the infantry takes the brunt of things. I mean, cave trolls already a little bit damaged, but they are going up against spears, so that's not the worst target in the world for cave trolls. Dunedain troll slayers, what are they going after? I mean, as much as they are troll slayers, I do think they're doing the right thing. Going after the fearmongers here, getting some good damage done right off the bat. I mean, as much as I criticise the way the defenders set out their stall early on, I'm not really sure what the Misty Mountains hope to accomplish by sending forward this force. I mean, conventional wisdom maybe says that these big old shock troops can do some initial damage and then you follow through with infantry, but the gap between these events happening is too large and it's not substantial enough either. If you're going to do this, it will have to be with the entirety of your army, and also your allies are going to have to be willing to follow you forwards as well. And it doesn't look like Angmar are in any great rush to do that. So, we'll see. This could still work out in the long run. The White Fearmongers as well were committed at the wrong time, but no matter. Mountain at coast already shaken again. The Misty Mountains morale is proving to be a real issue here. The sheer density of projectiles that the defenders are using here, very, very damaging to the Misty Mountains' mental fortitude. Greenway Garrison footmen are not going to be great against snow trolls, however, so this part of the line at the very least is going a little bit better for them, especially with the support of those Mountain Uruk hosts. Well, Rhudaur clansmen, a fight for the bridge. I mean, the bridges on this map make for very effective choke points indeed. Mordor having to go right into the teeth of Rhudaur's armour piercing, so the Etenor's troll hunters, also the standard archers that Rhudaur have available to them. Not going to go well initially for Podrick here. Mordor are coming forward with a lot of units. I'm going to try and force this unit of Rhudaur clansmen out of the way with sheer mass, but with another unit of Rhudaur swordsmen and the numbers Rhudaur have, I don't know if they're going to be able to do that without the support of their Great Shield infantry, which would be better at dealing with these projectiles anyway. Let's not forget as well, this in the old version of the game, the Rangers are still in their full power. Very, very dangerous in this kind of battle. As the Morse Troll Hunters, I need to launch a few more projectiles in as well. Punishing opening salvo when it comes down to the real battle for the attackers, as much as the initial moments looked a little bit suspect for the defenders. The attackers now have to face the reality of going through these choke points, but they do have the numbers to be able to do so. Spearguard making their way across. I mean, they're being afforded a lot more room here actually by Cardolan, which is quite interesting. So Isengard have got a good opportunity to establish a bit of a beachhead on this side of the river, which I think again is a little bit of a judgmental mistake by the defenders. Cardolan really should be getting a little bit tighter to the bridge and doing the same thing that Rhudaur are doing. They may not have the terrain to be able to take as much advantage over it, but it's far better than allowing Isengard to acquire territory on this side of the river and give the attackers something to build from. Numbers are their friend after all, giving them a little bit more room. Exactly the sort of thing they will be hoping for. And shuffling around a little bit. Meanwhile, over here, some elements of the line being forced backwards. Cave Trolls, Goblin King's Bodyguard as well. Also Dunedain Peacekeepers and Pikes moving forward again. There's far more space here than I was expecting. And the enemy general is fleeing. Who's that then? Was that the Misty Mountains? I mean, what unit were they in? Was he in the Black Uruks of the Mountains? We should be able to see him if it is him. I can't imagine it's any other army's general. The Misty Mountains are the only ones that have come forward with this level of aggression. The Goblin King's Bodyguard are not running away. The general didn't die either, so he's got to be around somewhere. Snaga Archers. I mean, the Misty Mountains have definitely been the fall guys here. This is perhaps a good opportunity of hyper-aggression executed poorly. And Arthedain reaping the rewards so far. Snaga Archers trying to arc their shots. I mean, just taking stock of what's still back there. Angmar still have pretty much their full strength. The Misty Mountains going forward once again. But there's so much routing going on here that that's been the main issue, really. There is a lot of dead bodies over here, but it could have been far worse in those terms. So it has been a case of overextending, not having the necessary support. And if you do that with the Misty Mountains, they are the faction in the game which have the poorest morale on paper, and that has definitely proven to be their downfall here. Again, Angmar in danger of making exactly the same error. They're leading the way with their trolls, their infantry lagging behind a little bit. Good opportunity once again for the defenders to do the same thing. Angmar, though, will be a little bit more resilient. Stuff like the Barrow Wights, when they eventually make their way across as well, will make it so that they won't be quite so easy to get rid of in their entirety. Cardolan, meanwhile, ready to face the Isengard force of Red Knight. The Isengard Ballista has also not been as much of a fixture as I thought it would. I don't know if they have quite the range to be able to hit the main body of the Arthedain forces in behind, but if they don't, then they need to think about moving it and trying to get some other angle on someone else, because like that should be cause for the defenders to really regret their decisions to defend the river, and while it looked like that was going to be the case initially, it hasn't really worked out that way. Meanwhile, Cardolan facing off against Isengard, like I said, in the composition phase. May very well be the last time we see Cardolan in their old uniforms here. Cardolan vastly improved visually in the new patch, I think, but this has been the Cardolan aesthetic for a long time. Blocking Isengard as they move forward. Cardolan showing their own morale deficiencies as the half-orc Vanguard bundle their way through some disorganised pikemen, getting into the Rhudaur clansmen now instead. Some support coming in from the Rhudaur marksmen as well. Isengard still have a fair amount of units across the bridge. Trying to corral your units across the bridge is not the easiest task in the world. Meanwhile, over here, a very, very simplistic fight indeed. Rhudaur simply plugging the end of the bridge with as many units as they can muster and then doing damage with their ranged units. Rhudaur as well, actually probably one of the very best factions in this very specific situation, purely because of how good their throwing projectiles are. You can easily get your throwing projectiles into a position where it's going to be far harder for the attackers to be able to respond to them, so you can get free damage off them without reprisal more easily than most, and that is usually the way that you want to be trying to deal with Rhudaur, try and take away their throwing projectile effectiveness, but with that being so difficult to do here, Mordor really are struggling. Rhudaur are very, very comfortable, you would suggest, and Mordor are not really having too much left in the tank either. You can see what way the wind is blowing in this battle. Trolls of the White Hand getting in here to try and batter their way through here. Standard Rhudaur swordsmen, standard Cardolan men-at-arms. There's also the mercenary guildsmen in here as well. A little bit of armour piercing on them, so they will be a little bit more effective, but ultimately still rather basic line infantry, so they're not going to be melting through these trolls, even this previous game version of the trolls. Isengard really the only ones to make any ground, and that was only because of the way the defenders decided to set their stall up on this bridge anyway. Isengard's ability to take advantage of that is going to be determined really by how much manpower they have in reserve. Heroic infantry making their way across, but already wavering. Essamor's troll hunters throwing javelins. And here we have spearmen are shaken as well though, so morale could go either way there, at the very least. Heavy goblin crossbows firing away, so the Misty Mountains still alive. Angmar taking the lead over here now as well. Some good iron troll slayers up against the Witch-Realm Scourge Raiders. Don't know if they were able to use their ammunition or not. Some Misty Mountains units returning from routing, trying to assist Angmar in their attempts to huff and puff and blow the house down. It seems certain only a military genius could win this battle. Just behind orc skirmishers, attempting to make their way forwards. I mean, there is some units in here. I don't know what defending units are here in the middle of this mob, but it's a good opportunity for the defenders to use some ammunition on it. Rangers, if they are able. Still Blackback Mountain Berserkers here as well as the Goblin King's bodyguard, so a bit of a strong point of the Misty Mountains army still. And that is enough to actually rout this little block of Arthedainian troops. Arthedain struggling a little bit. I mean, if this had happened earlier on, if Angmar were willing to follow the Misty Mountains in right from the start, I don't think Arthedain would still be standing. There's a few Cardolan units over here as well, but I think it would have been a very big ask for them to do so. They are going to need to get more ammunition from somewhere though. Angmar slowly but surely will be able to force their way through basic rank and file units from Arthedain and Cardolan, especially in this older version of the game where those standard units from the Western Kingdoms of Men are a little bit understaffed. Snaga, Blackback Mountain Berserkers pushing onwards. Cardolan sending over more units. Black Wolves from Rhudaur. I mean, there is some damage being done now. The Isengard Ballista trying to rip up the line of the Minhiriath Man-at-Arms. Isengard struggling to maintain their position though. The support from the Rhudaur units I think is the key here. Able to assist the Cardolan units, and Sauron's will are now routing, and Mordor suffering the same fate as they have been for the whole battle over here. This is why Rhudaur don't need to use all their infantry. They just need enough infantry to stop Mordor's progress, and their ranged units will do the rest. So a little bit of infantry support for Cardolan is very, very possible to provide. Executioner's taking hits. Orc archers. Temple guard as well. Rodram Javelin's also pretty good in melee, pretty fragile in melee, but it's another damage spike that the defenders can use to their advantage. Guard now routing. That's a bad sign for the attackers, still struggling to gain any footholds that stand the test of time. Wargs trying to make a nuisance of themselves, but crashing directly into the front of spears and heavy swordsmen means that they will melt away fairly fast, and they end up routing as a result. They may very well return, but maybe not if they bundle through more hostile troops, which have Hammer Guard on the front line now though. They're definitely a bit of a tour de force, the sort of thing which can be extremely effective against Arthedain and Cardolan especially. Crunching through the armour. 2-9 rangers, Minhiriath sharpshooters, out of ammunition, skirmishers being used more and more now, although dismounted Fornosterine knights are a bit of a newcomer to the front line. And these sorts of heavy swordsmen do have a tendency to be effective against the orcish factions. Especially when their target is goblin trackers, they will carve through a unit as lowly as they. Scourge Raiders running, and Angmar have made ground against Arthedain, but once again, overextension is happening in small pockets, and that's why we're seeing so many of the attacking units fleeing in the opposite direction to where the fighting is occurring. Heavy goblin crossbows, Half-Orc Spearguard meeting up with one another, but this central bit of territory is really the only thing that the attackers have managed to gain completely. It does technically cut the defenders off from one another, but if they chose to focus on retaking that ground, they would be able to. Uruk-hai crossbows try and do their thing. Javelins now. Rousing the Uruk-hai crossbows, Red Knight struggling to keep any sort of army together. The Isengard ballista still firing across the way. I mean, if they can shoot into these units now crossing the bridge like that, that's exactly the sort of thing the attackers need a little bit more of in this battle. Uruk-hai berserkers as well will be able to hold the bridge long enough for that ballista to work its grisly magic. That's a lot of damage done there. Artillery can be the great equaliser after all, though usually it's the case that the defenders are having to rely on a bit of good fortune from their artillery shots rather than the attackers, but there we go. Arrow fire raining down. He seems certain only a military genius could win this battle, apparently. Victory almost a certainty as well. Temple Guard's still alive, pretty much the only unit from Mordor that's still here, and I was going to say on this side of the river, but technically speaking they've already started crossing the bridge. I mean, the armor-piercing arrows are all well and good, very good base damage, but I mean, in all fairness, Rhudaur have started to move a lot of their units to other parts of the field, so it's not as if Rhudaur have gotten away completely scot-free with this fight. There's actually Nazgul over here as well, so the Arthedain berserkers and Rodram javelins will have to do some heavy lifting. It may end up being a far closer fight than it looks like it was going to be for pretty much its entirety. I don't think Mordor, however, will have anything to show for it, and ultimately Rhudaur did send quite a few of their units in support, including the enslavers, who are still at full strength, over to help out Cardolan, and indeed they're the ones taking the initiative and trying to cross the bridge as well, so take Mordor's sudden, fairly even looking footing with a pinch of salt there. Snaga archers fleeing. Once again, we're looking a little bit thin on the ground from an attacking perspective up here. Still plenty of time left in this fight, however. High infantry getting involved with the very few peacekeepers and Dunedain rangers that remain. Still the heavy swordsman taking the lead. Angmar marauders now. Whatever happened to the hammer guard? Surely they didn't rout. Surely they weren't killed off in their entirety that quickly, were they? Ones of the North may have been capable of doing so with their steel bows. Snaga skirmishers going after these dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights. The old unit model for the the Barrow Wights here once more. Excuse me. Again, could be the last, or one of the last, certainly, times that we see this variant of them. Further back. While Marauders running, they don't really have any reinforcements left either. Baneguard that are just routing, so yeah, this is kind of it now. We're trying Blackguard on the way forward. I mean, this is a lot of Barrow Wights, but Barrow Wights are usually best as the first units in. It means that Angmar don't really start to fall apart. If they're the last units in, they don't really have the damage dealing capabilities to be match winners or momentum shifters in the way that many of Angmar's other infantry units can be at the high end. The Witches may actually be the great equaliser here. Well, I really thought the game was crashing then, but the general has fallen. We've got a nice, very extreme close-up view of the water, and I can only imagine it was probably the Isengard general. The Nazkai are in here after all. Nazkai and Uruk-hai Berserkers are pretty devastating in terms of the damage they can chuck out. Blackwold's not quite as strong. A few javelins coming in. And the Atomor's Troll Hunters trying to do their thing. I mean, Rhudaur have been fairly domineering based on the situation thus far in the battle, but they are now being tested by some of the very best that Mordor and Isengard have to offer, so will Rhudaur be able to just about lumber themselves over the line? Even if they don't, then they will be fairly happy, I think, with the performance of their units. And the Enslavers being sent over to try and help finish off the Temple Guard, and a bit of support coming in from the Orc Archers, so trying to gain what victories they can here late on. The attackers, Isengard Ballista crew, getting involved too. Pikes on the front line. I mean, I think actually Isengard will be victorious over here, just because the Uruk-hai Berserkers and the Nazkai are going to be too strong without any bodyguard presence over here. Mordor, I think, maybe less fortunate. Temple Guard are very strong, but it is 3 fellow bodyguard tier units they're having to face off against, and the armour piercing on all 3 of them will find its effectiveness against the fallen Númenóreans. Meanwhile, Guardians of Khand Dûm moving forward, but a little bit battered and bruised. And here our sharpshooters, maces will be effective, but again, they're not dedicated infantry, and there are Barrow Wights close by, so the armour piercing alone may not be enough to make the difference. And here, Blackback Mountain Berserkers are still alive. They've lasted far longer than the rest of the Misty Mountains force, which is kind of interesting. As a dual-wielding unit, they're probably the only dual-wielder in the game which you don't really think of with their survivability in mind, because of the survivability that dual-wielding offers in melee. They are a little bit more fragile, but they're also very, very savage. They've lasted a long time here. Dunedain Troll Slayers doing their thing, Dunedain Rangers, Dims, Captains as well. Dim Spearmen charging in. Guildsmen. It's always an interesting moment when you see Cardolan feel willing to take to the front like this, with mercenaries and basic units leading the way. It's a sign of confidence, because of course morale can very quickly tip the scales the other way if you are unfortunate. Still missiles coming in from the other way, however. Goblin trackers, almost a Rhine Knights. I mean, the Barrow-wights' presence on the front line is making the morale situation a little bit questionable, perhaps, but you can see it is pretty much the Barrow-wights that are holding this assault together, all on their lonesome now. Elsewhere, do Rhudaur have what it takes? Cardolan pikemen are going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting on this engagement here. The Uruk-hai berserkers are actually falling away as a result of them being here, I think. Blackwall's also playing their part, so maybe I wasn't giving the Cardolan pikemen enough credit in that sort of situation. Which enslavers now on the front line. Temple Guard defeat now seems certain, with all the bodyguard units making their way to the front. It's always going to be a big ask. Those wicked looking tridents. Probably the only great axe unit where it actually makes sense when you see the killing animation where the two-hander gets run through its opponent. It was a little bit peculiar when they do it with the blunt end of an axe. Not impossible, I suppose, but still. Temple Guard routing. And the Orc Archers are wavering as well. As soon as the Rhudaur units get close, I imagine that will be the end of them. So Mordor now gone, really. Yeah, and the Orc Archers end up routing before Rhudaur even have to make any sort of moves. So the northern battle is won. Rhudaur do have a few units they can transition over to other parts of the field. Barrow-wights getting forced up against the river as well. So I think it's fairly plain to see now the defenders are going to be winning this. It's just going to be a fairly lengthy clean-up operation given the quality of the Isengard units and the type of the Angmar units that remain. So there we have it. The Orcish factions, with their powers combined, usually in this sort of situation you would imagine them to take the battle by the scruff of the neck and have success, especially in this version of the game, but that was not to be the case here, and given the initial worries I had, the defenders have done reasonably well, albeit I think the attackers have probably played this battle in exactly the way the defenders would have wanted. Aggressive, but not consistent with the amount of units being committed. And also committing units in such a way that allows the defenders to make full use of their ranged support, which is always a massive factor in battles like this. Reforged Javelins on the front line over here now as well, 21 of them, not quite up to the task, are facing this calibre of unit all on their own, but also dismounted Knights of Illuminus up here as well, so that would certainly not go amiss, though in terms of unit type to unit type they don't trade that well with the Nazkai. And archers being used as melee fodder now. Barrow-wights, it's really just a matter of time. The Barrow-wights may well drag a few of the rank and file units down with them, but you can also see still a few projectiles coming in, because that's still ranger ammunition as well. Look like a clear projectile or two. I don't know where they are, mind you. No, there they are. Cardolan's variant on the Dunedain Rangers in the background. Not the best angle for them, but there are also some Witchround Blackguard in here as well. 42 of them remain. Not the easiest thing to bring down. I mean, I must say, like, it's mostly basic units. Other than the Wardens of the North we've seen loitering in the background down here, it's mostly basic units Cardolan and Arthedain have left. Is that a concern, perhaps? Don't know. Further northward. Arthedain. Now the dismounted Knights of Illuminus join the fray, as well as a few Dunedain Troll Slayers, 46 of them, so more aggression as well as a defensive unit, but now in terms of sheer numbers I think that's going to be what breaks the back of Red Knight's final combatants. There we have it. It's weird, there was a little bit of back and forth in terms of where I thought this battle was going to go based on the various opening of the engagement with the Isengard Ballista and the Trebuchet and then the Misty Mountains odd assault, but everything that followed on from that only reaffirmed the defenders' advantages, which is not usually the way this kind of battle goes, as we've seen several times in the past, so it is a bit of an odd one, this. Angmar's general falls at the hands of a Dunedain captain. They've been skulking around over here somewhere, blending in. 64 fresh to the fight as well, and they will be one of the few units that should actually be able to deal damage at a fairly decent pace to the Barrow Wights. Still fighting to the bitter end, but I'm sure they won't last for too much longer now. Fairly impressed there's still the odd Blackwold, or is that actually, no, that might be the no, there's 2 Blackwolds allegedly in here somewhere, considering they suffer from the same sort of rapid deterioration as the Uruk-hai Berserkers. I'm kind of impressed that they've managed to stand the test of time in any capacity in a fight like this. Yeah, perhaps they have the Rhudaur pikemen to thank for that. And that is going to be it from Isengard. I think 1 Mars-kai remains. It is actually one of the Blackwolds that finished him off as well. Big old chop to the top of the head. Now then, Angmar, the last one standing. To no one's great surprise because of the presence of the Barrow Wights, the Evendim Spearmen. The Snagar Archers are routing. The Evendim Spear is going to try and surround. I mean, Barrow Wights have managed to rout off, by the looks of things, a lot of the basic Cardolan units that were surrounding them. It's going to have no effect other than actually clear the path for the Cardolan Rangers and also prolong the inevitable, really. As the Ranger projectiles continue to rip through these units. Victory seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. Again, in this sort of situation, whenever you see that tooltip, I feel like it would take more than a fool. I feel like it would take someone needing to exit the game for outside reasons and admitting defeat, where none could be found otherwise. Horns of the North now getting involved, and it's about time. They should be able to help, especially with the Dunedain captains close by as well. Help cleave their way through the Barrow Wights. Support of the Rangers will help hasten things along as well. Where are the Dunedain captains? Where did they go? Like, again, much like the Hammer Guard earlier, we haven't been away from this little battle for that long. They kind of all perished. Especially considering, I think it's the Cardolan bodyguard unit, so there they are. Barbad Warhammers as well. Unused? That would be a sign of how perhaps poorly executed this attack really was. Still, the fighting continues. Evendim Spearmen do surround the Barrow Wights. I mean, this does have an effect on the melee defense of the units, actually. The main source of the Barrow Wights' longevity, of course, is their extreme amount of hit points. Everything else about the unit, when you look at it, you would wonder why they're so effective, but that hit point value alone is what makes them stand out. Just having a look at where the bodies lie, you can actually see how far the attackers were able to get at one point. It's kind of a weird situation because the line was getting overrun in some locations, and if they had their whole armies willing to make that initial burst across the river, I do think the defenders would have been overwhelmed actually. The line wasn't constructed to be watertight by any means, it was just the way they were sort of, not single filing, but sending their units in columns and waves of columns that ended up not really working out for them at all well, the attackers. But they had opportunities to be able to take advantage of the holes they were making down here at the very least. Isengard, you can see where the lines were mostly set up, and then Isengard crashed against them. Bit of Rhudaur support meant, however, that ultimately they didn't have the manpower to sustain it, and they got pushed back to the bridge where they ultimately perished. Mordor never really got off the bridge. You can see that the Blackguard of Barad-dûr did push through further than the rest of the army, but ultimately the Rhudaur forces were too thick. And the range support over here was always going to be a real problem for Mordor. Mordor, I feel a little bit sorry for in terms of the job they had to do. Isengard afforded a little bit more courtesy, but with a bit of Rhudaur support, it was always going to be quite difficult for them as well. On this map, as we've seen in the past, it is often this river crossing where things start to go awry for the defenders first, and as we've already mentioned, the defenders did have the potential opportunity to make sure that was the case, but ultimately they were not able to take full advantage of that, and as a result, the original defensive positions didn't really move the whole battle long. So this has been a very, very different battle to what I was expecting based on the initial deployments. I thought we were going to see a fight entirely for the settlement, but instead the settlement has merely been a feature in the background, and it has been an entirely river crossing focused fight. River crossings can be a little bit one-dimensional, admittedly. But this is a pretty good showcase of what happens if you do not construct your attacks well. I'm always in favour of being very aggressive as the attackers, because very often it does yield good results, but you need to be able to control your units in a fashion that was a little bit more cohesive, shall we say, than what especially the Misty Mountains and Angmar were able to do today. Still, kind of an odd battle. Not a terrible thing for perhaps one of the last times that we see this variant of the game. We're still alive. It has to be a Barrow White, right? Still the sounds of battle. Ah, there he is. At the bottom of the hill. And it's because he's facing off against basic man-at-arms and he's lived for this long. There he goes. Just in time for the Rhudaur general to actually make his way over as well. So there we have it. Defenders, definitely the right team won, I think, though usually I'm always eager to give credit to the team that won more so than criticise the team that lost, but I really do think that on this occasion the way that the attacks were structured was the main issue. And the defenders, like I said, the attackers played this in exactly the way the defenders would have wanted. Other than the loss of the trebuchet early on, everything happened as the defenders would have wanted it to. So yeah, all they needed to do was stick to plan A, and they never really needed to deviate from that. Not as many kills from Cardolan, admittedly, but then that's because Arthedain were taking the lead on the river crossing with 2, and Rhudaur, of course, were able to do horrendous damage to Mordor, enough to the point where they were able to also be in the driving, or at least in a co-pilot seat, shall we say, on the main choke point that Cardolan were watching over as well. So let's see what did the damage for Rhudaur. 853 on the front line. Rangers, obviously this is the sort of thing which we're not really going to be seeing too much of in the future. Loads and loads of kills from them, but also the ideal situation, as we've already said. Throwing projectiles were also used to very good effectiveness as well. Troll Shawls getting over 200 kills each. Troll Hunters, 200. At least 100 kills on the throwing projectile units, except for the Arthedain Berserkers, but by the time they were being committed, it was to try and help finish off stuff like Temple Guard and Uruk-hai Berserkers and the like, so the lower amount of kills is understandable there. Rhudaur Marksmen doing very well as well, so basic archers once again proving to be very effective when they're allowed to utilise pretty much the entirety of their ammunition in a perfect situation. So yeah, big thank you to Colonel Speaks for sending this one in, big thanks to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. Again, bit of an odd one, But it is a good showcase, I think, on the dangers of being aggressive but not structuring your attack cohesively enough for it to be effective, and also the dangers of overextending yourself. The morale situation for the Misty Mountains proved to be pretty damn unfortunate. But yeah, either way, it was an interesting one, to say the least. I don't know if I don't have anything else in the backlog from this older version of the game. Still, we may yet see a couple of things before it disappears into the annals of history, but we'll have to wait and see. This is actually the end of my backlog as it stands, weirdly enough. There was another battle I was going to do on the new patch of the game, but because of a new version of it coming out, and some weirdness with regards to the assets folder that was needed in order to make the battle work, unfortunately that will need to be rerun, I think, on the latest version of the game if I am to show it. So there may be a way for me to make it work still. I'll have a rejig with the assets folders, and we'll see if it can be made to work. So I may have one more thing on the new patch before my backlog is completely run dry. But if not, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, I am 3 weeks ahead of schedule at this point, but it is a weird situation when I have nothing to record or nothing to plan to record. Yeah, we'll see. It's always, I think it's unavoidable that this is a situation that we run into when we consider the fact that the game is being tested and the player base is still split 3 ways, I think, at this point. So, and also people will only send me stuff on the new patch if they want me to show it because it's good or there's a new map preview or something like that. So it's always going to be the way, I think, which is probably why it's a good decision that I've decided to go for confirmed videos for Saturdays only, and any bonuses will now appear on Wednesdays instead. You know, even if I didn't make that an active decision, I think at this point I would be forced into it anyway. So maybe a bit of clairvoyance there, but no matter. Once again, big thank you to Colonel Speaks for sending this one in. Big thanks to all the players. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me